So, John, thank you very much for talking to me. It's been an eventful sort of 12 to 18 months or so for us. How has the DDU weathered that storm?
Well, it certainly has been a tumultuous year for the whole profession, hasn't it? And I don't want to repeat any or too many cliches here, but certainly in the very early days, it really difficult times for our colleagues adapting to ever-changing guidance, closed practices. The 3As, as we'll remember, was there at the time. So certainly our focus was to maintain the levels of service to members, because they were calling up in huge numbers wanting immediate advice, quite understandably. So our focus was to get our systems working very, very quickly. And the second limb was to be flexible in terms of membership subscriptions and all the rest of it. And again, immediately, because of their financial needs and the changes in their practicing. And our advisory team are pretty much home working in any event, so we were able to get everything else on board really quickly, and hopefully members found it a pretty seamless transition. I'd like to think so, yeah. And we, for example, we pride ourselves on, we know that when members call up for advice, they want advice there and then, and they want advice there and then from a dentist colleague who knows what it's like to be in practice. And our stat is that over 98% of our calls are answered within 20 seconds. And I'm pleased to say that, even though we had this real bulge in demand, we were able to maintain those stats. So that's the key to that, really.
There's been plenty of uncertainty to deal with on behalf of dentists and everyone in the profession throughout the whole pandemic, really. Have you seen that being reflected in the sort of queries that are coming through to you, or certainly were coming through to you at the start of the pandemic?
Sure. I mean, as you can imagine, unusual circumstances prompted unusual questions. And interestingly, a lot of colleagues whom we wouldn't normally hear from were calling up for advice. Everyone wanted to stay the right side of the line. They wanted to do the right thing. They wanted to apply the procedures correctly and do the right thing for patients and stay out of difficulty themselves. One of the questions, interestingly, that were asked a lot was, am I indemnified if? Am I indemnified if I do this? Am I indemnified if I do the other? And I think the very question suggested that we've got work to do in explaining to people how things work. As a not-for-profit mutual members organisation, our members can and could look to us however they interpret the guidance. But the key thing is, obviously, if they act in accordance with a responsible body of opinion, then we're much more likely to be able to successfully defend them. So we're not the arbiters of current teaching and practice. We don't tell patients what materials to use for a root canal filling or whatever. But clearly, if they act in accordance with a responsible body of opinion, which may not necessarily, interestingly, be a majority of opinion, then we're in a position to successfully defend them. And those were the key things that we discussed with members and were able to reassure them about. One of the things that we sort of said was to sort of start with the end in mind. What I mean by that is, okay, you've got a tough decision to make. It's an unusual decision that you wouldn't normally have to make. If you make that decision, you do X and something goes wrong or there's a complaint or whatever, what would you say in response to any criticism of you? What's your rationale for that decision? And if you can comfortably look back and evidence the thought process and the logic and the operating procedures and all the rest of it that you applied to that decision, then you're not likely to be justifiably criticised. And the other important thing is to sort of show one's working out, as they used to say in maths. Again, you and I might reach a slightly different decision as to how to proceed. But again, if one can show the logic and particularly patient-focused decision-making that goes behind that, again, then we're in a really strong position to successfully defend. And I think those general dental-legal principles were the key things that we discussed with our members. You know, although they might ring up with an individual particular circumstance and we could apply it to that, it's a bit of a give a person a fish, teach a person to fish principle, in that if one can apply those key principles to decision making, then you're not going to go far wrong. And those were the key things, really.
And have you seen the last year changing the nature of complaints that are coming through from patients?
It was very interesting in the early days that the number of complaints sort of fell off a cliff, really. Although we were getting way more inquiries from our members, they were of a more general nature, as I've just said. As the complaints have started to come through, I think perhaps patience, if I can use that term, is starting to wear a bit thin, and their understanding is perhaps wearing out a little bit. So we're seeing complaints about treatment availability to some degree. There's been a bit of shooting the messenger involved. You know, the standard ones, but with a twist, sort of dissatisfaction with treatment. Most patients were quite understanding, but there's been some issues around fees, particularly capitation type fees. I've paid you my monthly subscription and wasn't able to come and see you. Fortunately, the vast majority of patients realised that those fees meant the practice was still there when they needed it, and were sophisticated consumers in that regard. Communication's been difficult, naturally enough, because colleagues weren't seeing patients directly face to face, which gave rise to a whole new set of challenges. And then, of course, the PPE, you know, additional barriers to communication with you know, for example, people with you know, hearing loss, or children, or all of those things, just magnified the normal day-to-day difficulty that comes with dental practice. In terms of very specific ones, of course, we had some complaints about the COVID secure measures themselves. Colleagues often between a rock and a hard place, some patients complaining that they were too onerous and too heavy-handed, other people complaining that they didn't feel safe and they wanted even more. And again, that's when one uses, you know, one's judgment, applies a responsible body of opinion, and whichever side that patient's coming from, we're in a strong position then to respond to that sort of complaint, really. So yeah, we're seeing them coming through. I think colleagues have coped incredibly well, and by and large, the vast majority of patients have been pretty understanding. I'm quite a visual person, and I have my sort of, in my mind's eye, my sort of seesaw of practice life, and all the happy, grateful patients are on one side of the seesaw, and the relatively few patients who are, you know, unhappy, whatever colleagues do, will be on the other side, and we know which way that's tipped. But it's all too easy to focus on the wrong side and you know, feel that we're always under pressure, whereas the vast majority of people are really grateful for the services that the dental team offers to them, and refer people in, and all the rest of it.
Absolutely, I think it's really easy and also understandable for clinicians to focus on those complaints rather than, yeah, like it's human nature, isn't it?
Of course it is. Yeah, of course it is. And it, you know, and it hurts when you're doing your best for people and they don't necessarily see that. And you know, that's why we're here to support colleagues in that way.
So you know, we've talked about the complaints coming through, and if we, I may be wrong in talking about them as being distinct from claims. You know, have we seen claims with sort of merit behind them increase, or perhaps more pertinently, the success rates of claims increase over the last year?
Sure. I mean, it's slightly early days, Guy, for us to see that. There's often what we call a tail, the sort of delay period between an incident and the claim happening, hence the need for occurrence indemnity, as you'll be aware. And the two are sometimes inextricably linked. You know, sometimes an unresolved complaint can become a claim. Sometimes it's a claim straight off the bat, and there's nothing in between. In general terms, we are pretty successful, and we successfully defend the majority of claims across the board. So in the majority of cases that are brought against our members, there's no indemnity payment. We successfully defend them. It's a little bit too early to say what the impact of the pandemic will be, but one of the key things is context, really. It's really important that it's remembered the context of that decision making, the circumstances under which clinical decisions were made. And there's an old quote from Lord Denning, who some people will remember. And Lord Denning quite famously said that one shouldn't look at a 1953 case through 1956 spectacles. And what he means there is, as we've said, that you should look at the circumstances under which the treatment's provided. And that's why record keeping has been really important, because we've been advising colleagues to map that decision making to the guidance that was in force at their time. You remember I said a little bit earlier on, to show one's working out. That's in the records, you know, and if that logic is there, then again, that gives us the ammunition to successfully defend those claims. And that context is really important in a regulatory sense as well as in a claims sense. You'll have seen some of the statements from the GDC, CQC, NHS England, health boards, etc., to say that they're aware of the difficult circumstances colleagues were working in, and they would take those into account. It's really easy, given the distance in time, to forget that very quickly. You know, and if I asked you what the standard operating procedure was in May 2020, it'd be really difficult to precisely put one's finger on it. But I promise you, we're keeping score on all of that, and we've got reference to all of those things, and we'll certainly apply them in you know, defending not just claims but regulatory stuff as well. By the way, we're talking about claims. Mythbuster again. You know, it's often said that, you know, we'll just settle claims for expediency or to save costs or whatever. Our members' reputations are really important, and we would never ever settle claims, you know, just for those reasons. We'll always defend claims wherever possible. You see a case recently that we were successful in, and always we would involve members in those decisions. So if ever you see that myth peddled, don't believe it.
Duly noted. Thank you. Do you get a sense then that from your members that they feel differently about the importance of indemnity post-COVID? Has it helped them realise just how valuable that is?
It's an interesting question. I mean, our member numbers have never been higher. We're certainly not complacent. And as I said to you, we'd certainly engaged with lots of colleagues with whom maybe we wouldn't normally in a normal year. So I'd like to think that we've been able to demonstrate to them our sort of strength in depth, etc., in terms of the knowledge of the team, the empathy that colleagues have, because they are all our dental legal advisors are themselves dentists with experience across a wide variety of clinical settings. And we've been around a long time. You know, we've been around over 135 years, our parent company. It's not just access to indemnity for claims, it's risk management advice, it's support on a day-to-day basis. You know, across the organisation, I think we assisted 35,000 inquiries last year. So it's a broad church, and we're here to support. I think there's often a focus on GDC cases and things like that. Given the number of patient interactions and given the number of registrants, it's a comparatively small number who end up with a GDC case, and certainly in the latter stages. But it's that sword of Damocles, it's that concern that's constantly there. And I think it's really important that we put it in perspective for colleagues. The chances of a career-changing dental legal event are fortunately incredibly low, and with prudent risk management advice, then we can make that even smaller. For those who unfortunately do get there, I mean, we've got expert in-house lawyers, and 82% of our GDC cases that involve our members at case examiner stage didn't reach a hearing. I mean, so that again, it is a stat we're very pleased with. And for those relatively few that did reach a hearing, again, 82% were concluded without any finding of impairment. So the work that we can do with members during the process, again, can be really helpful. I think while we're talking about indemnity, I think I certainly won't duck one of the current questions that's out there, and that's about discretion, and you'll have heard an awful lot about that. There's an awful lot been said about it, and an awful lot of misunderstanding out there. I mean, we assist our members with over 99.5% of requests for assistance. So, you know, I think it's important to recognise that, and you know, not to believe any sort of mischievous suggestions that we do otherwise. Our members are our raison d'etre. Without them, we wouldn't need to exist. There's nothing wrong with insurance per se, and indeed we've offered insurance ourselves in the past and may well do so in the future. But it's the nature of the organisation that's offering it, and as I say, we've got no shareholder profits. We're here just solely for our members. And indeed, in the past, when we had insurance and an occurrence sort of wrapper, there were occasions when the insurance wouldn't pick up a matter, but we used our discretion to support members with the, you know, the discretionary wrapper as a safety net, if you like. It's important to realise, and I don't think people are naive enough to believe that insurance will respond in every circumstance. Of course, they don't. There's a repudiation rate for any insurance product, and there are certain circumstances where insurance can't and won't respond. And you know, I think perhaps a case in point being the business interruption issues that arose around COVID, when some people thought that their insurance would respond and it didn't. So I think it's certainly not a black and white thing. And as I say, insurance per se isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I don't think it's necessarily the you know, the golden ticket that it might be actually being painted as. In fact, there are certain circumstances that one can't insure against, and things like criminal activity, etc. There'd be a moral hazard to dilute the deterrent against criminal activity by insuring for the consequences of it. And of course, that's why the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority, etc., exists, in order to pick up those circumstances.
So to move away from the subject of COVID for once, to what all we've talked about for a long time, but you know, aside from that, what are the big concerns being voiced to you by your members now?
I think there's a whole variety of stuff. I think one of the issues that it's important that we're aware of is, it's been described as blue on blue, really. Complaints by colleagues about colleagues. They're not all vexatious. Some of them are, I mean, Principle 8 of the GDC standards about raising concerns. Some of them are colleagues genuinely concerned about their duty as a registrant to raise concerns, etc. But there are steps. It's a stepwise thing, and before anybody ever raises a concern, should certainly speak to their defence organisation and get a steer on that, because it's not necessarily straight to the top. It can be a stepwise. So we're still seeing far too many things along those lines, and I don't think one can separate the nature of modern practice and the contractual things that go with it, the circumstances under which principals operate, associates operate, etc., from what goes on. And it's really important that patients don't end up caught in the crossfire of some of those business and contractual issues that arise. So things like robust associate contracts and the like are really important. We've introduced a contract checking service that's intended to be equitable to both parties. Of course, you know, a lot of our members are principals, a lot of our members are associates, and there's a way to find equitable ways for, you know, those arrangements to be fair to both. And I think, if anything, we're seeing a lot of calls around those types of sort of business and contractual things that inevitably then have fallout for patients who at the end of the day are those using the service. So I think that's something that we can certainly look at, and from a dental legal perspective, from a claims perspective, from a complaints perspective, and even from a regulatory perspective, if we get those sorts of things right as a profession and look after each other, you know, there's an educational term, and it's a community of practice. It doesn't mean brushing things under the carpet when they're not right. That's absolutely not the case. But it's about treating each other fairly and looking after each other as colleagues, you know, mental health and well-being and support. And there are some great examples of that out there. Local dental committees do terrific work, etc. And I think as a profession, I'd like to see us do more in that regard as a cohort looking after each other.
So how do you see the next 12 months changing things for the profession as a whole, given the amount of disruption we've seen over the last 12 months?
Sure. I mean, yes, some of that disruption has been really difficult and disruptive. And of course, it's caused waiting lists and the things we've talked about already. But on a positive note, I think there'll be some really positive stuff to come out of it. I think teledentistry and patient access to information and things of that nature will continue and develop. And I think patients want to see that. I think CPD will be delivered digitally. I think it's important to meet colleagues face to face and not to do all of one's CPD or online or whatever. But I think, you know, the reach that CPD providers have to colleagues in rural environments, for example, etc., and the option to do lots of things, I think that's going to be really positive. In our world, I mean, the vast majority of the GDC hearings have been held remotely. By and large, that's been incredibly successful, and indeed arguably less stressful for those who've actually been involved in it. For certain cases, we'll still dig our heels in and insist on a face-to-face hearing where it's in members' interest, particularly those, for example, where there might be dishonesty allegations or something of that nature. I think skill mix is going to develop. We're going to see that coming to the fore. You're probably aware there's a GDC scope of practice review ongoing. Initiatives such as advancing dental care are about to report, etc. So I think we'll see skill mix, team working, and again, looking after each other within those things are really important. Some things don't change, however, and I've been in this business longer than I care to remember, but the key thing at the core of everything that we do and see is that it's a people business. And it might sound screamingly obvious, but it is a people business. And if you think of the 4 domains of foundation training: clinical communication, management and leadership, professionalism, all of those 4 bits of that jigsaw together are really important. And I think it's really important for us all to remember that, and things like communication skills, etc. You know, not just doing CPD on one's, you know, favorite clinical activity or whatever it is, to become the complete practitioner. Because those are the colleagues who we see who have least difficulty, because they're able to manage patient expectations really well, etc. So strangely, I mean, sometimes particularly younger colleagues will say, you know, what do you think is going to be the next big thing or whatever. Arguably, it might be back to the future, and I think there'll be a real demand and a real opportunity for success to deliver good quality, high street family dentistry, done well and delivered empathetically. And I think that there'd be a real success for that. Other people will go in a different direction and set themselves up as sort of purveyors of youth and beauty, if you like, etc. And that's all fine, but we need to understand that's a different group that we're working to, and we need to understand and manage their expectations. There is a thing on the GDC website that I encourage colleagues to look at, and it's a series of Ipsos Mori, the pollsters, surveys that the GDC has actually commissioned. And it's really interesting looking at patients as consumers. Patients are quite sophisticated, and they can tell the difference between when they're being treated as a patient and when they're being treated as a consumer. Have a look at the findings, they're really interesting. But interestingly, although you might think, well, that's a good thing, and we're on safe ground then, the bar for suspicion over trust and dishonesty is lower when they think they're being treated as consumers. So we've got to be quite it's a complex area really, and if we market to people, etc., we must expect them to behave like consumers, and therefore we need those skills to go with them. So there's a real insight in those surveys to what makes patients tick. So I'd certainly recommend those as a good steer.
The DDU has a new chief exec joining in September. Are you able to talk about what their plans for the organisation, or what the future holds for the DDU?
Well, that's right. Dr. Matthew Lee's taking over from Dr. Christine Tompkins, who's retiring in September after a long and illustrious career supporting members. Christine's been in the role since 2009 and worked for the company for over 36 years, and Matt's been with the DDU for over 20. I'm sure he'll broaden the level of the number of services, the range of services to meet members' ever-changing needs, but it'll be done so on that basis of guiding, supporting, defending them in accordance with our principles and our ethos as a not-for-profit mutual. You might not realise, but for a number of years, we've been the only UK defence organisation to have a clinician at the helm. And of course, with Matt in place, that will continue. And I think that's really important as we put our members' interests at front and centre in all that we do. Because after all, our members are our employers.